Welcome to the Leadership Zone. My name is Sheila Walsh, and I get to host fabulous conversations with amazing guests all the time. So today we have Al Pacifico, France, with us. And I'm going to let Al introduce themselves first, and then we're going to kick off into some really interesting conversations about some of the misconceptions about inclusion, some of the things leaders are challenged by, and some of the things we can do to move forward in this area. So Al, would you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your work, what motivates you?
Thanks so much, Sheila, and great to be here with everybody. Yeah, so a little bit about myself. My background began with business psychology. Always been fascinated by people, and I'd run businesses in the past as well. So that combination of how people and business works together was a big motivator for me. And then I worked a lot in organization development. So that's taking the whole organization in and thinking about how you can transform it towards whatever strategic goals you might want, including culture change is a big thing for me. And then most recently, I did a global experiential program all about Gestalt-based leadership. So if anybody's come across Gestalt, the real principles of working with the whole person and lots of other things that's all about, very much humanistic based. So that's kind of my background in terms of the education and work. And then I apply that mostly in diversity and inclusion. I work a lot with leaders. I'm big on transformational development. I do it for myself. I love working with others who are up for that. So that's I think a quick introduction to me and some of the work that I do.
That's excellent. I love a snappy introduction. You said you just did a global piece. So where's your kind of general regionally, where are you based when you're doing this work? Where do you tend to do your most work?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways to answer that, actually. So I have worked globally and across Europe and based in the UK. I'm originally from Manchester. I love it, as everyone probably does, when you get somebody who speaks like you. That whole, like, I get, the language, you get that kind of feeling of closeness right beginning when you see an accent that sounds like where you come from. But I'm based in the southwest of England now, in Brighton, so I do a lot of work from home, which helps because I have a disability as well. So a lot of it is virtual, and then that opens up a whole other opportunity then. So I can work globally virtually. But yeah, generally it's UK and European organizations that I work with, but I always have a kind of global hat on, so to speak, so that we have that alternative worldview to work with.
I think that's really important because one of the things I'm discovering in a lot of leadership literature, not just in terms of kind of maybe the research side of things, which is maybe a different beast to talk about a different day, but even in terms of the books and things, one of the biggest challenges is there's a high percentage of one worldview in those books. And even in my leadership book club, we're discovering that we're like, oh, like it's helpful, but actually it's written from one point of view, maybe typically for one point of view as well to receive. So I do think that global lens is really important. Let's start with kind of the way that you support leaders, because I think that that's really helpful. I know that from my work across Ireland, the UK, and Europe as well, that leaders are having lots of challenges. One is wanting to be good, like wanting to get it right, wanting to make the right decisions. Another is thinking, is this really appropriate for our organization, our business, our purpose? And another one is people who have very different political views, maybe to what might be aligned with more traditional inclusion efforts. And I think that's causing a lot of challenges. So are you finding something similar, or are there other things that you're noticing leaders are pointing to as some of the challenges they're facing?
Yeah, I think they're all really spot on, actually. And I'd add into the mix reputation and what the organization's there for. And I think that's sometimes what people see as a barrier and is more fearful of people taking action. But there's a tension there because, particularly after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, everybody wanted to be seen to be getting on the bandwagon of saying something. There was a higher pressure for organizations to say something, but they then didn't know how to follow it up. And also now there's this tension of, oh, we need to be reputationally good. We need to be good and attract employees. We need to have a great product or outcome, whatever the organization is. We need to do good in the world sometimes. But if we go for this particular thing, is it going to cause us a backlash? Which often it does. And then they don't know how to deal with the backlash either. So, yes, all of that, I would say, are some of the challenges. And one of the biggest things that I work with is complexity and uncertainty. You know, that VUCA, VUCA, an acronym has been around for a very long time now, but everything is just getting much more complex and uncertain. And D&I is a real example of where that sits as well, I think.
I love that point because I find that often when I'm being hired or we're working with organizations, and I'm sure you have something similar, they're looking for like some kind of guarantee, do this, but don't do that. Make sure this isn't the outcome. And in my experience, the most effective diversity and inclusion efforts occur when this person uses this word all the time about fermentation, it's guiding. So I find that we're more effective when we guide and cultivate, allowing some things to emerge rather than control and dominate, which can sometimes be how some people attempt diversity and inclusion efforts. They go in and they say, you can and can't say this. This is right and that is wrong. And I have so many issues with that because who said? And
Well,
often it's not people with lived experience, or it's not even legally sound and not from the right people is the first thing. And then secondly, it ignores the fact that people in this room might have a preference for that conversation that you haven't even acknowledged. You've just assumed they don't relate to it. So I find that a lot of efforts try to give certainty by giving rules when actually they're denying some of the reality, which is inclusion is a social process in society. Diversity just exists. Difference is human, but inclusion is a social process. And so we can cultivate it and we can interact with it and we can co-create it. The minute we control it, it's not going to result in inclusion because we're missing something. So I find it's easier for people to sell promises that result in short-term tick boxes than to actually work with some of that uncertainty and to support people how you would respond to the uncertainty. And I'm thinking about some of the biggest cases like across the UK, Ireland, even Europe, around, people jumping on the bandwagon of a movement without understanding the purpose of the movement and it having all sorts of backlashes. Do you find that people are able to accept that part of the process is emergent? Or do you find that takes a lot more reassurance by you having a good relationship with them? What's your sense of how people feel safe moving forward without kind of fake promises, I guess?
Yeah, I think that takes time to build. And I feel like that's part of my job as a consultant. I'm really clear about the type of work that I enjoy and where I think I can add value, which is on that transformational end that you're talking about. It's more taking a developmental approach. I often get people come to me and asking for one-off learning type events, training. There's a lot of D&I trainers out there. And I'm quite clear that that's not what I do. I create developmental experiences. That's how people kind of sit with that and gain those skills that you're talking about. People need to learn the skills of emergence, the skills of dealing with complexity. I encourage organizations as a whole, as well as individual leaders, to create their own moral and ethical guidelines for themselves, because sometimes people think inclusion is just being nice to everybody. Well, no, there are like rules, there are guidelines about if you go down this route, it's not going to be helpful for your employees or your stakeholders or your, whoever else it might be. But that's the process. It's a process for an organization to think, where does our boundaries lie? What are we going to stand up for? And what are we going to defend in line with our goals and opportunities? But yeah, it does take a while for me to build that trust and to build that competency. And in the worst case scenario, sometimes people will be, yeah, I'll go for it. And then I get scapegoated. And so the risk that they've kind of stepped into, this happened once. They were like, yeah, we're up for it. We're really capable. Just throw it all at us. Do something really deep, which I did, because I often start with personality, which is a really nice diversity topic to get into without getting into some of the more personal stuff. They're like, no, let's go for it. Let's talk about personal stuff. Let's talk about identity characteristics. And then when they realized people weren't as skilled and they only wanted to do one thing, and I was like, I don't do one-offs. And then they find a way of scapegoating it. And that's not helpful for the organization either. So really it is that it's my skill in helping educate the client about what's possible, what's worthwhile, what will make a lasting, sustainable change versus what they're willing to come to me with. And sometimes I'll make kind of concessions on that, with a goal to building the relationship, and knowing that actually part of what I do as an OD consultant is helping develop that client as well, you know, partnering with the client. Whilst you might not end up getting paid for this part, but I'm often partnering with the client in their own transformational development around diversity and inclusion. Yeah.
I think that that's really important. I think one thing is that I have found people believe they have higher capacity. It's a bit like the self-awareness thing. We overrate our self-awareness. And one of the things that I have found increasingly important when you're trying to make that relationship, but also help people not go down kind of the topical route, you know, but
Yeah.
make decisions that are like strategic, sustainable, you know, effective for what they're trying to achieve, is kind of showing them that, you know, these additional efforts aren't actually getting you what you want. So increasing that doesn't get you what you want. And I'm the same. I avoid all one-off trainings, but if a client is saying, we don't know where we are, we want you to come in to see how it lands, I'll do that, because what they're trying to do is kind of a litmus test of, you know, where are we in terms of capability, insight, challenges. I think you can do, depends how you approach the trainings, right? That's what I think is different. Whether you approach the training from the point of view of, I'm going to challenge you to think differently, or I'm going to tell you what's right and wrong. And I think you can have a transformational opportunity within a very standard keynote or small training when you've designed it that way, and you've designed it to get people to think about the gap maybe between where they are and where they want to be, rather than giving them a list of kind of a checklist, which is what I'm usually approached for. Like, tell us what we should or shouldn't say, you know, how do we address the gender, how do we address race? Like, it's all this kind of, tell us the playbook so that we don't have to think. And I think that that's a really, really big issue in terms of people understanding the difference between knowing something doesn't change much. We know that. Like, I know I should eat better and I eat what I like because that's my preference, versus actually the things that help people change behavior, whether it's individually or within a system. So I really like, it seems like we're really on the same wavelength about understanding that what's needed is transformation, but we also have to meet the client where they're at. We have to help leaders feel safe with just the right amount of stretch and not so much that they fall like through a bucket. I spoke about in my book once that I used to come in through HR a couple of times. Like, it has not a lot. Often I come in through the C-suite, and I would prefer to come in through the C-suite, and usually the CEO, because that's the ideal person, because I can have real conversations about them and there's not kind of all these barriers to the truth that they're hearing. The amount of reworked information by the time sometimes the C-suite or the board or even the senior leader gets the information is not helpful, you know? So I've written up my reports, remembering I write in strengths-based language. I appreciate that what exists for a reason, even if we don't want to continue it. So it's not condemning it. I write as if the paper got it, it shows the efforts you're making in the space for growth. It doesn't condemn you in some way, right?
Yeah.
Unless now they've broken basic discrimination laws, which is they wouldn't get that in a report. It'd be a completely different situation. I think we'd a rehaul situation. But I've had them not give it to the C-suite. So I've had, part of the contract was I write the report and then it would go to C-suite. But because it outed the HR director in some way, or it outed maybe a lack of capability, or it outed a kind of misrepresentation in some way, even sometimes that the D&I practitioner was maybe advocating for political efforts rather than for what was appropriate within the workplace. Like, it can be really small things. They wouldn't have got the report. And I always wonder how they made that make sense after like paying for the project. Part of the deliverable was a report and usually a meeting with the C-suite.
Yeah.
If I didn't come in through the C-suite, then I often wonder how they framed it. And they definitely haven't framed it, we don't want you to see this information. Like, nobody's framing that. And it hasn't happened a lot, thankfully, but it has happened enough that I know, like, it's happened twice, that I know if I go in without a connection to the senior leaders and without an understanding of what's important to them, the efforts don't really align to the organizational strategy, its purpose, or even, you know, what good looks like in 2 or 3 years. It just aligns to a KPI belonging to somebody, usually at a much lower level. And that's really, I think, ineffective when I'm trying to create support transformation. So I'm wondering, are there any kind of like misconceptions that you think are kind of being touted around organizations around inclusion or diversity and inclusion efforts, or even equity? And are those misconceptions getting in the way of maybe effective interventions or transformation? Is there anything that kind of springs to mind from your client work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about there speaks to one of the biggest, which is D&I as a separate activity. And I think that's what happens. And I wonder in those situations you're talking about, has the HR person even needed to explain away why they've not created a report from that piece of work? Probably not, because they're probably fighting an uphill battle power wise and priority wise because the C-suite doesn't get it, or because they're not able to have a wider influence within the organization. Like often HR doesn't even have a space on the C-suite, or it is through, I don't know, some finance or somebody else, which never seemed to make sense to me. But I think that's part of it. You know, people see D&I as a side of desk, additional effort, or a people and culture or HR style thing. And I think that's one of the biggest things when people start to realize diversity and inclusion is about everyone's roles every day, every action that you take, and they only manage to do that by some of the other things that you were talking about, which I talk about, the fundamental attitudinal and emotional shifts that create change in behaviors rather than just learning something new. You know, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have, and that totally shifts the way organizations approach work in diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting because I was working with someone recently and they said we want to improve our diversity and inclusion policy, and I said, well, then don't have one and have it weaved into all your other policies. And they were like, how would we do that? And I was like, just pick a random policy and I'll review it to show you. Like the very first policy that they handed me, I can't even remember what it was. We were like, well, if you wrote it like this and you wrote this like this, it would then become this area's responsibility, or whenever we deal with this, it would become integrated into this way of working. But I do think that that side of desk thing, like it's really ironic because I train diversity and inclusion practitioners through UCD's professional academy, and I upskill them with CPD and things. And so it's funny because I don't believe the role should exist. I believe that we sometimes need a dedicated role to start the integration process, but I do think that there are some real issues with the skill set we're requiring. So I would argue that without an OD background, your attempts at diversity and inclusion are going to be kind of topical, once off, not systemically engaged. And now some people will have that style of approach from doing community interventions and not OD. But a lot of the time, and this isn't a criticism of diversity and inclusion practitioners, sometimes the reason people are drawn to it is because their own identity or the relationship with the topic or their interest. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the like psychology of organizations or organizational development, or even a relationship with the long-term influence, but they might have a really strong relationship with advocacy or with promoting a particular political or human rights perspective, which are valuable, like deeply valuable. But I think that there can be an issue with influence when there isn't a broader background beyond the topic. So it's almost like, to me, you need a practice back here, and then you have an area of specialty. But your practice isn't based on your area of specialty. Your practice is how you do what you do. And then you learn specialist knowledge, you stay up to date, you read things, you advocate, you develop yourself so that you have some expertise. What's your sense of that? Do you think, yes, Sheila, I think that sounds sound? Or are you thinking, actually, I need to push back, there's some more considerations maybe?
Yeah, I'll add to it. I definitely think that the first place to start is if an organization's not been doing anything, it helps having a D&I person.
Mm-hmm.
I do totally agree with their abilities and capabilities, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But at least, even if they're only starting with policies and procedures and HR process, that kind of stuff, it's a beginning. Deloitte a little while ago did a 4-stage inclusion model, and I really like that. And it starts off with, organizations often think about what's the risk averse place of how do we keep ourselves legal, and then it moves into this is a HR activity, and then there's a tipping point where the business leaders start taking responsibility. And I think that's the point where people need to be to get to what you're talking about, which is actually we can be strong enough now not to need a dedicated D&I person. But I'm working with an organization at the moment, and I will actually recommend that they do get that dedicated D&I person, because they're not there yet. They're not going to get there without that step in the middle, I think. But talking a bit about the capabilities and the requirements, I totally agree. I was talking to a recruiter quite a while ago, and I hadn't realised how unique it was to have an OD background and be working in diversity and inclusion. And those two things do go together in a way that I don't think people realise is the first thing. And then the other thing that you're talking about, I think impacts everybody who works on D&I, including people who work in these kind of so-called employee resource groups, which I fundamentally disagree with that
Oh,
term.
I need to talk about that
Let's
because
use
I
our
disagree with them.
marginalized employees as a resource. Anyway, but I think what's going on there and what I've learned is to be in this space, and OD people will recognize this, is you use yourself. There is a whole part of OD that's all about how you use yourself in your work. But to do that when you're working in D&I, you have to manage your own trauma, right? You have to have processed enough of what you've gone through. And I had to redo this all over again when I gained my disability after an accident a little while ago. You know, that was a whole other stream of processing that I needed to go through so that I could use that in a positive way, so that I could learn more about the communities that I was kind of stepping up for, which isn't just my experience in the disability field, and then not be so reactive as well, you know. So there's that thing where activists are really pushing, partly because they're so reactive from a bad experience they've had. And don't get me wrong, I've had all those experiences and all of the different parts of my queer mental health, dyslexic, whatever else. And I always say I always forget something because there's so many boxes that are part of me. They're not boxes, but anyway, beautiful splash of colors. But yeah, as an individual, you have to be in a place where you can manage those so that you can then influence, I think. And that's true of every leader. You know, you're mostly going to be interested in stuff that's impacted you, but how can you manage through that? How can you also examine your privilege? And that's another misconception. You know, people just think, oh, well, you're just going to have a go at me because of my privilege. No, we need to include that. We need to meet that. We need to work with every part of everybody. So I always talk about my white privilege as well, my educated privilege. I feel like I've been on a bit of a rant there, but I was agreeing and building, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So there's a couple of things that I think are really powerful about what you said. I'm going to try and capture them. So one of the things that I think is really powerful is thinking about, so I don't think identity doesn't matter. I just don't think it qualifies me, right? So like,
Yes.
however, I also have to acknowledge that sometimes people have taken roles who haven't worked through their identity stuff. So I'm going to talk about white privilege. And then that becomes a problem as well, because actually you might have a background in OD, but you have an idea that you are not part of the problem, or you don't gain an advantage. And so then would I rather somebody who had less privileged identity in the role because it might be less harmful? Maybe, you know. I kind of think that there's this balance between, in workplaces, between lived experience, professional role, and appropriate context. And I say this because everybody has a colleague of mine. He's like, stop saying lived experience. Every experience is lived, which is true. Like if I say I have experience of something, I've lived it in some way. He's like, it might be personal, it might be professional, you might have, but it's any experience you have is lived in some way. So I was like, it's a really good point. So you might have, so somebody might have personal experience, and I think that that can be valid, and it is valid. And I think people have professional experience, and that's also valid. I think one of the challenges is that in society, because we know that oppression and marginalization is so dominant in just how society functions, that people with personal experiences of harm through marginalization have to shout really loud, right? And they have to center their personal experience as valid. In organizations, I find that can be unhelpful for a couple of reasons. One is you may be accurate because of your experience in society, and you may be even accurate about the topic, but you may not be taking into account legal requirements, which we know has happened a couple of times in the UK. We've had a couple of cases that didn't consider, like, their interpretation of the legislation wasn't quite their personal interpretation. But also there might be some other issues, such as you might want to do a particular thing because it relates to your identity in some way, but there might be a really good reason that can't occur in the workplace for whatever that is, right? And so I think in the workplace, we need to listen to people about their needs so that they can come to work and contribute to work. But we also need to leave space for the fact that there are other professional positions that need to also filter through this conversation in the workplace for it to be sound. So for instance, I had someone a couple of years ago say to me, so we're going to make these recommendations and then it's going to go through legal. Like, so they're just going to stop it. I said, no, wait a second. Their job is not to stop it, but it is to check that it's legally sound. And so if you've made recommendations that are not legally sound, the organization cannot do that. And that person saw that as an affronting to their right. I said, no, in society, we can argue legislation all day long and protest, and I believe in that. But in the organization, the legal team don't get to advocate for legislation. They have to actually abide by legislation. So it's a different position. So I think that sometimes our own idea of who we are in the world comes into work without identifying if this is the place to work with that. So for instance, I advocate all day long in society, but in workplaces, I have to work with people that have very different views to me. If I want to be effective, I have to sit across from people with all sorts of worldviews, often oppressive worldviews, and I have to meet them with the same dignity and respect I want every person to be met with, without facilitating the oppression in some way, or the marginalization or the harm. But that doesn't mean I get to show disrespect to individuals in a work setting that I wouldn't want shown to anyone else. And I think this can be really difficult in this area, because a lot of this area comes from external societal activism. And I have no issue with that, but I think there is a maturing that we need to do in terms of what that looks like as a practice, as a professional practice, rather than just as a political, societal position. What's your sense of what I'm saying? What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're reminding me very much of some work I did with a global philanthropic organisation. And it takes me to a place of, I mean, whilst I am not clinical, I don't have a clinical background, I'm not here to diagnose. I think with my psychology background and with an OD and an emotionally intelligent, informed approach, one of the things that I like to do is get to the bottom of what's going on. And in this particular organisation, what had happened was, you're right, some of the stuff is kicked off by society, but the organisation was reflecting society, which our organisations do. And unfortunately, it was set up in a way that people had become aware and more understanding of. It was a racist, kind of institutionally racist, some of the stuff that was going on. And what that then does is kicks off trauma. So the type of people that you're describing to me, who have got a very much activist kind of purpose, are somebody generally that is in a position where their personal trauma has been activated for whatever reason. And then I know from my personal experience, it can be something probably insignificant, sometimes insignificant, sometimes significant in the present, but then that kicks off all of the past. And then you're realizing you're sitting in an organization and a society that is only going to reinforce that. And COVID did a lot of that with my disability. There were so many structural, institutional things that still exist today in physically getting around in organizations that are a real challenge. So I think what's important here is two things. One, the organisation gets really clear about how D&I impacts its overall goals, its operating principles, what it's there to do. And this particular organisation was, like I say, it was philanthropic. It was working with a lot of disadvantaged communities across the globe with a lot of diversity. So it was absolutely essential to this organisation that they really did meet head on some of the issues that had happened, which is the way that racism had kind of come through was unfair performance management and clearly unfair progression and promotion decisions. And so some of those things really needed to be addressed. So that's one thing that you have to get really clear about. And then the second one is understanding what's going on for that individual. I had a good colleague of mine come to me for some supervision a little while ago saying, oh, somebody did a survey and stress and wellness was a big thing for them. So I did this intervention. It was a load of stuff, how people can help themselves with stress and wellness. And I was like, oh, hang on a minute, because the challenge with that is it reinforces the individual's responsibility. And actually what they found through the feedback was, what we're telling you is we are stressed because of your structural inequity. And this is another myth. Our organisation is fair. All organisations, all structures reflect the inequity, the unfairness that is in our societies one way or another. We can't get away with it. It's how we deal with it and how we examine it. So that's what I then kind of help the organisation understand, that it's this structural change that needs to happen. So I think it's those both and, you've got to work with that person and help them be more effective if they are being really activist and unrealistic with the goals that they might want to achieve, and kind of recognize that they're going through a trauma response probably, and how can you support them to do that so they can get where I was talking about, which is I've had kind of somatic experiencing therapy and all kinds of other stuff. So I get really aware of how my body gets activated to the emotional kind of response to what's going on in the outside world. That takes a lot of skill to get to. But if you're going to be a great D&I practitioner, for me, that's where you need to be.
It's really interesting because I advocate for supervision constantly. I used to go once a month. I now go twice a month. And I have two different supervisors who know about each other. So I'm not like, that way people like kind of secret therapists, but they have, while they both work with a similar, we'll say, practice in the background, they have kind of slightly different specialties up front. So one specializes in anti-oppressive practice, which has to come into my work. And then the other kind of specializes in group dynamics. Some of the more traditional ways of viewing it that have got lost because we've kind of got preoccupied with team development and things rather than thinking about the unconscious relationships in groups. So I find that these two lenses are really helpful. And then I attend therapy as needed, kind of once a month or twice a month or 3 times a month, every week if it's needed. But the reason that I do this is that I found that there was a gap between knowledge and regulation. And I'm just reading the book My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa, and I'm going to butcher their second name, so I'm not going to say it, but it's about so they're a trauma therapist and a marriage therapist, and it's about the polyvagal theory, basically the physical experience of race in this case, and talking about, as opposed to white privilege, white bodies privilege, and it talks about how people respond to your body. It's really interesting because they share some really challenging points, not necessarily that I disagree with, but challenging points as in they state things like, this is how white bodies often perceive black bodies. This is how black bodies often perceive white bodies. And what I found really interesting was how they describe black bodies perceive white bodies, because I'd never known that. Bar the jokes about Karen, right? Here's another Karen. Bar those jokes, I didn't really ever think about the depth of the way I might be perceived. And obviously they say very clearly, this isn't everyone. I'm giving you this kind of shared idea of how people's bodies react to these things. And that might not be true for you, but to think about it. And I think what I have found working with diversity and inclusion practitioners, supervising what I would call is like traditional coaches who don't necessarily specialize in inclusion, but as my work gets more kind of vocal around inclusive leadership and around the kind of psychology behind inclusion rather than the moral position on it, I've noticed I draw more people towards me who specialize in areas that maybe are underserved traditionally. I noticed that it's very easy to be right as a practitioner when no one's in the room with you or when you're talking to the group. It's very easy, and I include you and I, it's very easy to just see ourselves as our intention, but then to see other people as their impact. It's very easy. And I think I facilitate group supervision for this very reason, because I noticed that there's obviously a bias about how we talk about our client work, how we talk about the challenges that emerge, how we talk about the issues, because we're talking about it from our point of view. And the other person isn't there to give shape to the experience in terms of what you're blinded to. And I found that it's very challenging when we bring forward the ownership piece of it. So it's fine to say, okay, that's how you work through it from a practical point of view in terms of your practice, and that was within your boundaries, great. And then to say, now what was underneath? Like what happened in the identities between you both? Was there anything that's relevant that we haven't thought about because you didn't bring it because it's not on your radar? It's a bit like a really good point that Myra Chan made to me recently was, I was talking about how different groups have different challenges. So for instance, if you're working class, that's going to be a predominant concern for you. And that, I've talked to lots of people with lots of different racial identity, and they'll say, when you don't have easy access to money, that might be the bigger barrier that you face. Not everyone says this. Some say it and some don't disagree with it. But there was a really good point, which Myra Chan said, which was, yes, but that's because, and I was talking about my experience of things, which is when white is the default, race is not relevant. So it's to know that anytime any part of our identity is the default, and that isn't to say it's correct or should be the default by any means, is to say that it's been manufactured to be the default, then we don't notice those things. And I thought about all the conversations I have, all the interactions, and I just thought about how many times I must have not known, because white is the default, that race was in the conversation. So I would never have brought it to supervision or to therapy because I didn't know that it was relevant, because it wasn't in my experience. But that doesn't mean it wasn't in the experience with the client or with the group. And so I think kind of that practice point, I would nearly, now that I'm thinking about it, I'd nearly lean into more than even your qualifications. Are you being supported, because all of us have identities usually that are marginalized in some way, and even if we don't, we have trauma and triggers usually of some different degrees in terms of how people treat us. But also, what's your relationship with power? I've found that our relationship with power has a really big impact on how effective we are. Do you know how to work with when you're depowered, or like, and I mean deprioritizing a power system in some way? Do you know how to work when you're the most powerful? Do you reject power while secretly like trying to absorb it? Do you control things to gain power? Like, and I think now that I'm saying it, okay, qualifications, but actually I want to see practitioners in, and not, it doesn't have to be top down type supervision, but in some reflective space where they are unpacking what they don't know that is emerging in their work. Because I know that for me, every time I go to supervision, I come away going, but also, I can remove that from my practice. I can reduce the harm I'm doing that I have no clue I'm doing, or even just reduce the ignorance that I might not have. And I'm talking about race, but it's not just relate to race, it relate to lots of things. So to me, actually, I don't just want qualifications, I want practice, which means some level of external reflection with you so that there's challenge. What's your sense of that? Sorry, I've talked about, because it's something I've been thinking about, qualifications or practice. And actually, I genuinely think I want to see people unpacking stuff with their role in mind, not just for the sake of it, but to know that actually I do this because I have an obligation as a practitioner to offer a kind of a developed way of working. What's your sense of that?
Oh, well, all of that. And yeah, I mean, I remember when I chose my MSc, I specifically chose a place that was very application oriented. And now my learning and development personally and for other groups is experiential, because it's all of that. I add in little kind of bits of that kind of knowledge that people need enough, and then throw them in a space, well, not throw them, invite them into a space where they can then begin to apply that. So all of that. And what I'm tempted to do is kind of bring it into some real concrete specifics about how I work with people. So if I'm thinking, like, I'm currently doing a piece of work where it's first time engagement with this organization, and me and a colleague are doing an exploration. So you were talking earlier about where we start with organizations. I love starting with interviews and focus groups, great place to start and really really understand what people are saying. And the two things that they were saying is, one, they're scared of speaking up. And that was from people of privilege, like you say, don't even know race is part of the conversation because they're white and they've not examined it. And then the second one is, if they're part of a marginalized group, and I've experienced this, scared of telling the truth, scared of like saying your story, because interestingly, we are taught to be fearful of the impact that we have on the other. We don't want to upset the other, and that's another narrative that was coming out. So it wasn't even I find it hard to find my voice. It was like, I'm still so used to fitting in and assimilating. So there was some of that going on. And then what I do, and how this connects to what you were talking about, is I talk about safety. I never guarantee it. I invite people in to discomfort, and I never expect myself to be safe. Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you in supervision about being more and more aware of who I am and the impact that I might have on others. But I am also really humble, and I know I will make mistakes. I know I will do harm to other people in a way that I will feel shame and I will feel deep hurt. And I've still got to go there. I can't expect other people to want to go there and explore what's going on without me being open to still doing it. Hopefully, the more in depth I get with this and the more of that I do, the less of it will happen. But I'm still my worldview. So there's some of the things. And then the other thing that I do, which we've not talked about yet, is I prefer to come from I did talk about holistic and complexity approach. What that means is I work with the whole person. And so when I do development programs, instead of saying, oh, I'll do this week, I'll do something on LGBTQ and queerness, and this week I'll do something on disability, I occasionally do that. I'm just preparing for one on neurodiversity at the minute. However, what I prefer to do is work with people on, this is a whole program. I've got like a 10-month program. In the middle, the two workshops in the middle, one is all about marginalization and exclusion, and the other one is all about privilege and power. And then everybody comes to it with, okay, well, these are the parts of myself that are marginalized and excluded. How am I going to find a voice? What is the impact of that? How do I celebrate my positive deviance we talk about? And then the other one, well, what's the impact of my privilege and how can we understand that as much as possible? And like you say, at least get it onto our mental agenda, our level of awareness. And so I think there's some of the practical things I do to take all of that kind of complex, personal, supervisory, our own experience as practitioners into this is where I start about how to do that with people and organizations that are just beginning to start out. I took that in a slightly different direction. I hope that's helpful.
I really love that because you're tying it back into how we deliver on results. And I think from the very beginning, and I'm going to wrap this up with this little piece, from the very beginning, we were saying it's going to be unsure sometimes. We're going to be uncertain, but that there's a process and a practice that we use to bring us at least forward in some way without guarantees that are not true in the first place. And I think that interestingly, even in this talk, we're showing the links between what might seem like, well, it doesn't really matter to me if you go to supervision, might be the first thing I ask when I hire a D&I practitioner for something. I'm checking that. I'm like, where are you unpacking your like certainty and also the power you have as the practitioner in the room? And, you know, but also where are you getting support? Because this might be hard, because sometimes it's hard. So I really like that it loops together so that we deliver what's needed. But unfortunately, sometimes that takes a process to identify in its full capacity. So Al, can you tell people where to meet you? There will be links below, but just before we finish, just in case anyone's kind of pulling out their phone now to quickly find out where you are, how will they find out about you? Your website, LinkedIn, best place to find you?
LinkedIn is the best place to find me. That's where I'm most active. That's where my dyslexic brain kind of gets its visual creativity on, as well as its kind of short, sharp focus. So LinkedIn, come find me on there. I try and post fairly regularly and keep you up to date with what I'm up to and inspirational quotes and all kinds of other bits and bobs.
Excellent. Thank you. And there'll be links to your website, links to LinkedIn, links to previous conversations below for everyone to listen to. Thank you for joining us today. I hope that was helpful for everyone listening. Sometimes I think we've sanitized the conversation on diversity and inclusion into some like simple pocket thing. And it's not just that we need to simplify it so that people understand things. We can simplify things without reducing something. And I think that the reducing of this topic results in leaders being confused, organizations wasting a lot of money and effort. And also it can create more harm because people can become disillusioned by your efforts. So if you are looking for any support around this, you can definitely get in contact with Al with the details below. You can read my book, Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organisational Complexity. I love that you use the word complexity, Al. It's like, yes, that's exactly the issue. And otherwise, have a good day. Thank you for listening. And hopefully we'll hear you at the next episode.